right, welcome to SENSESPACE. Today, continuing a beautiful series of dialogues in the series Christianity Beyond Itself, with my first conversation with Hunt Priest, who is the founder and director of Ligare, an organization exploring the very interesting, very important, very pioneering intersection of Christianity and psychedelics. So super stoked to welcome this conversation with you, Hunt.
Thank you, Jacob. Me too. Very much looking forward to what unfolds in the next hour or so and beyond, but
Likewise.
certainly in the hour.
Yeah. Well, maybe just to start, I mean, I get a sense from your story that you've been involved in Christian ministry for quite some time.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps you can share a little bit of your bio or your spiritual bio if you prefer, but like what's been the journey maybe that has informed a lot of your life so far, and maybe leading us up to this very unusual encounter that you've had with the powerful plant medicine psychedelic renaissance that we're living through.
Right. Yeah. So I grew up in a Christian family. I grew up in Kentucky, in the States, and grew up in a small town there and with a family very involved in our church. But when I say very involved, I mean, we went most Sundays, and it was an important part of our life. And grew up there, a small town surrounded by several generations of my own family, and went off to university, and then went to work in Atlanta for Delta Airlines in my early 20s, and that's probably where I feel like I began to claim a Christian ministry. Maybe like I said, I'd been a lifelong Christian, and but in my 20s, I became involved in an Episcopal church in Atlanta that had a significant outreach to people living with homeless people and poor people, and providing not just food but other resources and community. And I got very involved there and gave a lot of time, and then ended up moving at some point, maybe 8 or 9 years later, to another Episcopal church in Atlanta, where 80% of the congregation lived with severe and persistent mental illness. It's a very unique place that most people in the congregation lived in personal care homes. It was after the U.S. government had closed mental hospitals. So we were in a crisis in the 80s here. So this model of shared living for people developed. And in the neighborhood where this church was, it had been a pretty all white, middle class, upper middle class neighborhood. When the laws changed and Black people could move and buy property or live in other neighborhoods, the church, the neighborhood, like a lot of neighborhoods in the States, changed pretty quickly, went from majority white to majority Black. And the church almost closed there because a lot of the members had moved away. But the priest there at the time decided to see who was in the neighborhood, and they realized that a lot of the larger homes had been turned into these personal care homes. And so people were living there. And so the priest invited the people that lived in these houses to come over for coffee and Bible study. And over time, the church began to uh, be in community with people that typically you wouldn't find in a middle class, upper middle class Episcopal Anglican church. And I got there after all that work had been done. But over time, they developed an arts program there. So Tuesdays and Thursdays, people, up to 100 people, came every Tuesday and Thursday for, there was painting, there was wood turning, there was poetry workshops, there was an organic garden. And then on Wednesday nights, there was a community supper and Eucharist. And then on Sundays was pretty typical church worship, except most of the congregation lived with severe and persistent mental illness. Many of them were Black. Many of them were really pretty estranged from their own families and communities. So what I saw there was a church really not, it wasn't a do-good project of the church. The people that we were a part of were the church, and I was part of that. The 20% of us that had jobs and function maybe a little more highly functioning supported the whole church in ways. And I saw the church, I saw a new side of the church, which was a place that was actually in relationship with people on the margins, providing a place where people could find dignity, we didn't talk about diagnosis. And the relationships were very normal in a ways. And I drove the van to pick people up, and that was my ministry. So both that church, the bigger churches that had the soup kitchen, and then this church, the smaller congregation, I began to see myself as a minister of the gospel, not ordained, but which I think we all are, anyone that's baptized is a minister of the gospel. And I started to claim that and got into leadership roles there. And I always had this nagging desire for, at least since the call to ordination in the Episcopal Church, and over time discerned that there. And it was about a 2-year process. And after that, I went off to seminary and was trained and came back to Atlanta for my first job. Went to Seattle for 8 years and served a congregation there. And it was there that I saw this ad in the Christian Century magazine for a research study at Johns Hopkins and NYU looking for religious professionals who were psychedelically naive, who had not done work with psychedelics before. So I'd been around it, but I'd never done any. And I thought, oh my God, Johns Hopkins cares what clergy think about something. And I knew a little bit about the mental health research, so I was intrigued by that, and applied, and didn't think I would get in because I would think everyone would want to be a part of that. And it took them a long time to fill it up. And so I was in that study in 2016. So it's been a while now. And I had 2 significant, profound religious and spiritual experience. I mean, lots of experiences, but 2, one from each that really awakened to me to what's possible, awakened me to myself and some of the issues I was dealing with, both with burnout and some anxiety I was carrying, and some just things that you start working through in your 50s, which I was doing. And had a profound experience with the Holy Spirit, a Kundalini awakening sort of experience, but it felt very much my understanding of the Holy Spirit, that the body's a temple of the Holy Spirit, and that it was moving through me in very dramatic fashion. And then the second experience I had a month later, I had this experience of my ordination being completed at the feet of the universe, which I really don't even understand what that means, but that was the experience I had, and which I think is to say, and it's not about ordination, it's about service to God. And I felt an expanding sense of my call to both inside the church and outside the church to be a minister of the gospel, and to bring what I had benefited from over the course of at least the last 25 or 30 years was spiritual direction, meditation, a real sense of Christian practice alongside belief. But I think that Christian practice gets lost in a lot of Christian circles, and really started engaging meditation and other retreats and silence and stillness and solitude. And so by the time I arrived at Johns Hopkins, I think I'd really benefited from the best of the Christian tradition. I'd had a lot of theological training. I'd worked with a lot of people to try to bring those sorts of experiences of God into the life of the church, with mixed results through liturgy and through just training people, teaching people about spiritual practice. So in some ways, everything came together. All these threads in my life came together in that study. I was, as I say, on a sofa at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and with a team of the world's leading psychedelic researchers who were interested in spiritual and religious experiences, and I had some. And it took me about 5 years from that. I moved, not for long after that, I moved to Savannah to serve another Episcopal church congregation here, where I live now. And over those 5 years, I knew that experience would change my ministry. I didn't know how. So I spent about 5 years. Well, am I going to be do I want to be a guide? I didn't know. And it took about 5 years. But at one point in the middle of the pandemic, I realized that there was no mechanism to bring the results of the study that I was in, or this whole other world, to the more traditional Christian community. And there needed to be a way to bring the beauty of the Christian tradition into psychedelic conversations. Lots of people are Christian or were Christian, or I'm finding Christianity in a new way through psychedelics. So just kind of bringing these two conversations that don't always connect to connect them. So that's what we're doing at Ligare, is trying to find the connecting points with that. So that was long. I'm sorry I went on for so
Beautiful.
long.
Well, I wanted
I'll take a break. I'll take a break now.
Bring to fulfillment. Thank you. Well, a lot to work with And I think the first thing for me was just a sense of like a pastoral call and a call to service that had
Mhm.
been present from an early age. And that's pretty real stuff, like
That's
picking up all of the possibly mentally ill congregation and bringing them to service and doing soup kitchens and things of that
yeah.
nature.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes. Yeah. I can see now, even from where I'm sitting right now, I can see where that church, the church, it's called Church of the Holy Comforter in Atlanta. And I see where I saw the pain and the brokenness of what mental, and I knew some of that from friends and family, but that extreme poverty, extreme mental illness, and just really almost being not untouchables in this country, and seeing what a spiritual religious community can bring when people are fully known as who they are and respected and
mm,
not patronized or not defined by their diagnosis, but human beings fully alive. And I see that in this work I'm doing. I mean, most of the people in that community would not be good candidates for psychedelics, but they were and are good candidates for meaningful community. And
mm,
that's the gift of that religion can bring. The established religions can bring is really we're pretty good at building community, making community, and being communities of care and known and being known and education. So and just being together, So I saw the power in that there, and less in more traditional congregations where people have other communities, and so the church is not always the primary community. And you can say that even about psychedelic space. There's a desire for community. There's a desire for container and structure and process. And I think the religions of the world have that. We've got also have a lot of problems, but I think we bring that's what Christianity, for example, can bring to the conversation is community, ritual, story, meaning making.
mm. Yeah, without a doubt. The world religions, Christianity, let's focus in on, has an incredible capacity to build and maintain community intergenerationally.
Yes.
And part of the power that's available. And for me, just for context, maybe just a little context here, like I became not involved in church from about 8 years old. And I became quite skeptical of my Christian schooling, and my father, whilst being a Christian minister, was still had a very kind of kind of postmodern like critique and like an anti-authority kind of critique, and so that was in me as well. And so I went through years and years of being a secular liberal, super interested in this meeting point of Islam in the West. And, that's a whole psychic question. Why was I so captivated by this sort of religious other? And that process for me, unpicking that and delving into that over many years in university, brought me to understand the value of religion through the mirror of the other. And I was kind of in this dialogue of like the Islamic communities in the West and then the secular Western more individualistic commercial culture around them and why this wasn't quite gelling and what did they have to learn from one another. And Islam is obviously even more, in certain respects, more, depending on your framing, potent or extreme
Oh yeah.
instantiation of religious structure, tradition, hierarchy, routine, having an answer to every single question provided for you through the tradition. Um, And so when then over the years, through encounters with psychedelics, I start to have this like, oh, what's going on? Like Christianity is starting to like activate through me, and there's all these different threads, and Rupert Sheldrake and different people kind of help me to like find like, okay, there's something valuable and beautiful here, and that's what I was pointing to with like the ancestral power of it is like when you go to a church that is very ancient or you participate in a form of practice that is very ancient, or a prayer that has been said over generations and generations, or a ritual, you have a sense that there's a kind of compounded power in that. And I think a lot of the recognition I've been in is like, well, a lot of us grew up alienated and disaffected, and the effect of that was like, well, we've had people in authority communicate something to us that we ought to believe without having a sense that they themselves are connected with the living essence of it. And that is the ultimate recipe for alienation from religion. But over time, and when you kind of find your way back in a very unique and individualized way, there's a sense of like, oh, like what's actually behind this? What's behind something like all these metaphors, the body of the church, the body of Christ, what's behind the breaking of the bread, what's behind the communion, and you start to see through and feel like, okay, this is a kind of cosmic grammar to connect with perennial truths and to stay connected with them in a ritualized and regularized way that can kind of ground your lived experience. So that's just my reflection back on
Yeah.
the value I see there.
I'm so glad you mentioned Rupert Sheldrake, because one of the things that happened to me before I went to seminary in that community, the Church of the Holy Comforter. It's a longer story that I don't need to share here exactly at all. But it was at a baptism of a baby, and the whole the at one point, and I was just watching. I was just there. I wasn't just watching. I was participating as a parishioner. But at some point in that liturgy, the whole room collapsed in on itself, which is the only way I can describe. I had what seemed to me to be a very profound mystical experience in the midst of a baptism in that church. And that's probably one of the reasons it sent me off to seminary, because I saw the power of it. I really couldn't describe it, but I sensed the power of what the ritual was doing. And then much later, probably after I started Ligare, or right around the time I read some Rupert Sheldrake, where he talks about morphic fields. And somewhere he says that liturgy, baptism, and Eucharist especially are potent with that energy. And I think that's what I was in. That was my sense of it, looking back on it now, more than 20 years later. Is that was we were all caught up in something that was much more potent than what we were saying or doing with our words, with our bodies. And yeah, I mean, there's something there. And I mean, indigenous communities certainly know that. Would be no news to most Native American practitioners in the North or South America. The potency of ritual. But it was, Western Christianity is pretty up here. And I think that's where I was for most of my career. And so coming back to my body and coming back to my heart, uh, that was through psychedelics. But seeing,
Wow.
sort of understanding the energy of potency doesn't describe it. The Pentecostal power that can happen when two or three are gathered. It's pretty scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Spirit is always present. And if we can shut our brains down enough and shut our mouths up enough, we might connect to it. I think that was my experience with psychedelics. It just turned off all this other chatter in my head, and my little bit my sense of either keeping the spirit at bay, or not really trusting the emotions of that. But it got me. The Spirit got a hold of me, and it re-energized my ministry. I came back from that with probably with the same zeal, or not the same passion and zeal that I had when I first was ordained. That gets lost when you're trying to keep an institution going, like the church, which is complicated and exhausting, can be exhausting. So, yeah, but the potency of liturgy, when we're open to it, it's not whether it's done well or not. It doesn't need to be done well. It just needs to be enough people need to be open to something actually happening beyond talking and singing. The talking and the singing can bring it about, but yeah.
So there's a kind of mystical receptivity that
Yes.
exists. Terence McKenna used to talk about psychedelics as a human birthright, that this was kind
Mm-hmm.
of, and not say it is for everyone, but from his standpoint, it was something that everyone should experience once in their lifetime, in the same way as like giving birth to a child, or becoming married, or, you know, um, fostering, hospicing the death of
Yeah.
another family member. Like it was seen as kind of like one of these events that you can't understand without experiencing it. But when you do, not for everybody, and I will note this because I know people who've been recreational drug users and explorers who've gone and done psychedelics, but they haven't done it with really a context of reverence or a sense of like I'm going into this to explore the mystery or to encounter the great other. They've just gone in more like I want to have a trippy time kind of thing, and that makes a big difference. Like intention is part of the alchemy of these substances and what we bring to them. So,
Yes.
and when we
Yeah.
do that, the body can open, and then we can step into a church, and it's like, oh, I'm not thinking about the kind of mental construct that has been maybe imposed or handed down to me, but I'm like, what is my body, what is my sensing like telling me about what's really going on here and what this means?
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah, sort of using psychedelic language. It's not just psychedelic language, the idea of intention, that comes up a lot of times in psychedelic. And I just wonder sometimes, what if we, before we walked into church on Sunday morning, set an intention, for example, that we're going to encounter the living God, or even something like, or that my intention this Sunday morning is to have something to have whatever this weight is I'm carrying to be removed, or have a new perspective. We just often just go in because it's what we do, but to set an intention, and the liturgy sort of set up to do that, and more liturgical traditions, but we just don't see it, and part of that's the failure of formation and sort of saying that over and over again, and really letting people trust that that's happening. But it becomes perfunctory, and
Mm,
psychedelics, like other kind of breakthrough experiences, like you mentioned, can reset things. And even those
yeah.
the things you mentioned are rites of passage: birth of a child, marriage, present to the dead, or rites of passage that are in my tradition and others, they're formalized. So there's we see Anglicans see marriage as a sacrament. Certainly, praying with the sick and the dying is sacramental. Eucharist, baptism. So uh, we've ritualized these rites of passage, and that's what we should do. And we've just lost, in some ways, lost the essence, lost the fire of them.
Mm.
And psychedelics brought the fire back for me.
That's beautiful. I love that languaging. Yeah. That
Yeah,
really brings, I mean, that language of the fire of the spirit is so charged in various Christian traditions. So,
mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's
and the
in the main line.
Pentecostal energy
Oh
too.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that it just I felt it had the energy to me that had the energy of the first Pentecost, or the Pentecostal renewal in the U.S. in the early 20th century, and it happens. I mean that the Spirit is constantly burning and renewing and empowering, and it's wild. And that's why institutional church often is keeps its distance. I did. It's unpredictable, and dangerous. It's dangerous.
Mm,
The fire of the Spirit can be dangerous because it can change your life. It changed my life. So yeah. Again, these things are these everything we're talking about. There's such power, and it's not that it's been zapped out of it. It's just I don't think we're just not awake to it. And that's again the gift of psychedelics can be that for people.
yeah. Yeah. I think it's interesting you use the word institutional church. Because that for me has been one of the big questions I'm carrying with the Christianity Beyond Itself series and the inquiry that I'm in, which is sort of like just the that framing that sort of koan of Christianity beyond itself is like, well, it's Christianity, but it's beyond itself. So how can it, where is it? It's somehow constantly in encounter with that which is other, and you can say that that's God and the Spirit, and that is the other as well. But it's also like the otherness of the world, the otherness of indigenous plant medicine traditions, the otherness of philosophy, philosophy is also a context of this. So
I think
Um,
about, I mean, I love the Christianity beyond it. I love that. But to step back even before Christianity, say even religion beyond itself. And I think about Jesus, for
mm,
example, with Second Temple Judaism, the institutional Judaism of the time kept trying to put him and others back in a box, because once we get comfortable, once religion gets comfortable with its own position and its own role, it often becomes content and doesn't want anything. Now we know what we're doing. This is what we're doing, and we're not going to go too far out beyond this. And I think it ossifies, and it's not a critique of Christianity, really. It's just that's what happens. It's just what we do. That's what humans do. We want to stay on the mountaintop. We don't want to go back down, and we want to stay with this encounter we have with God. Don't really want to go down and do the work. Uh, and we get comfortable. And the church got comfortable, at least in the U.S. and especially in the U.S., I think, got comfortable in the 20th century with its own position and its own influence and its own satisfaction with itself. It was prospering, uh, and I think now we're in a extreme moment of deep reflection. It's what we did before is not engaging people like it did. Just as a general rule, I mean,
mhm.
there are pockets, but yeah,
Yeah.
it, the church is the gathered body of Christ. That's one thing, and that exists inside the institution in some cases, but the institution is the institution, and it moved from the person to a movement to an institution, and it needs renewal always.
Hmm. Yeah. And how that renewal occurs, in relationship to what's inside of it and what's outside of itself, again, is part of that perennial dynamic, the tendency to ossify what's inside and then what's outside. And for me, I'm thinking about this core question of like, I was thinking about colonialism in the context of like colonial mindset, and how we relate to the other, like who is transforming who, right? And so when I go out into the world, am I in a posture of evangelizing such that I come like already really knowing and bearing the full truth, and I'm simply there as a vessel to impart that upon others and save them? Or am I actually encountering the truth of God through the otherness of them? And how do I actually do that? And my sense is that that requires a degree of receptivity and openness to a mutually transformative encounter with the other. And then it's like, well, that really rubs on the edges of people's Christianity, and especially if you're within an institutional church context, because you get pretty comfortable with how you do things, and this is what church is, and we do it this way every week. And then there's also kind of there can be in some churches, that can be a priming against. Here are the enemies. Here are the things that are threatening, and charge up the troops and send them out to spread the message. So, and yet there is a sense of like deep, like truth and logos that can come through these mystical experiences and coming into relationship with God over time. And then you start to like speak from that place, and that has a certain authority in it. But how to balance bringing forth that sort of, feeling the authority of that which you're connected to, and then also realizing that the other that you're encountering is also part of that great oneness, and not then seeking to impose on that. And so I'm just wondering how you're thinking about this, especially at the intersection of the Christian and psychedelic communities. And I just commend you also, like talking about Kundalini. I mean, this is very helpful to do this. Obviously, we don't want to lose the uniqueness of traditions, but to mutually map and play with language outside of our tradition is a very important thing, I think.
Yeah, I think some of my best spiritual formation has been in other traditions. In some way, I mean, I've really grounded in Christian formation for myself and teach it, but I think encounters with Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam, Judaism, has informed my own spiritual practice deeply. And in fact, in my 20s, I know now that I was looking for more contemplative. I didn't have that language then, but I had just gotten bored with Christianity. I've been off to university and had done some reading, and I just felt like there's got to be more. And I started reading a lot of Buddhism and like kind of got interested in Hinduism just a little bit, and just was really bored with Christianity. And I read a book called Living Buddha, Living Christ by Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk,
Mm.
Vietnamese monk, Living Buddha, Living Christ. And somewhere early in that book, he says, if you can find this in your own tradition and it's there, then go there first, go back to that before sort of changing your whole worldview and your own religious and spiritual tradition. Try to find it in your own. And that was, I think, the first opening as a lifelong Christian, the first opening I had to, oh my God, there is a lot. And Thomas Merton, I knew of him and had read some of him, but I didn't quite put all that together. So yeah, I think we can learn. I mean, certainly the Sufi tradition in Islam has been impactful for me. There's that. I think this whole idea of colonialization and empire and domination, and I think the church has often been very willing to be the partner in that. Certainly in the American Empire, to me, the British Empire comes up when I think about that because, for one thing, it's easier to look at somebody else. But I think about the British going to, for example, to India and trying their damnedest to create, like, sort of bring London to Delhi or something, so that as much as they could, they kept an English lifestyle, and they would have, I've read this thing that said they would read the Times of London, even if it was 2 weeks out of date, just to feel like they were still back home. And so I wonder about the British or American evangelists and missionaries going to other cultures and not being open to the presence of God and the Holy Spirit in that place. I mean, India is so alive with the Spirit, and if you're just going to stay in your box and sort of overlay it on others, you're really going to miss the transformation, and both of the institution that you're coming from and yourself and the other culture, because Christianity rose up in a very big intersection of the Greco-Roman world and sort of a Hebrew theology, and those just came into deep conversation, and Christianity emerged kind of in a very different from its roots because of its encounter with the Greek world, especially. So, and what might happen with Christianity as it engages psychedelics or mystical? It's not just about psychedelics; it's about being more open to mystical experiences and what we can learn from those and what we can share with those, instead of thinking we've got it all figured out, which is what we do. So, and we don't have it all figured out, clearly. So, yeah. And so part of the work we're doing at Ligare is to try to think about the impact of colonialization on plant medicine. I mean, the church has some atoning to do about that. I try to say that when I talk publicly. The church, institutional church, did a lot of damage in South America, North America, to indigenous.
Here in Mexico.
Yeah, oh my God, yes, and God, in South America and in the Southwest of this country, where people were working with plants and certainly had their own deeply held and profound religious systems, and we just came in and said, that's wrong. Nope, you're not going to do that. And if you do, we're going to kill you. And thankfully, those communities of as much damage as the institutional church did are still willing to share that with us. And I don't think we fully acknowledge what a gift that is. And it comes at a cost. It comes at a cost to their own culture. When you've got Americans coming to see Maria Sabina, or going to Peru, or going, trying to consume all the peyote they can.
Yeah.
Colonialism is alive and well.
It is remarkably auspicious that those things was suppressed to the best of institutional capacity, and yet still they just kind of receded to the edge, and the people in the mountains and the villages were still working with the mushrooms, and the whole story of the rediscovery of mushrooms by was it the Watsons
Yeah,
and
the
the
Watsons.
vice?
Yeah,
Yeah, just
it's
astonishing how that all came together. And it does seem like especially Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, if anybody wants to read the sort of story of this, it's brilliantly pulled together. But if you read that, for me, like I studied history as well, like it's just so mysterious. And there's such a sense that there's some hands moving in bringing this medicine back through and maintaining its vitality.
and
Yeah, and
even
so
and even those
yeah, go
cultures.
ahead.
You think about Maria Sabina or the uh, ayahuasca practitioners in Peru. Often, what they did was they adapted, and so Maria Sabina was a practicing Catholic, and her bishop knew, as far as I understand, her bishop knew what she was doing, and the Shipibo tradition brings in most of them have a Catholic background, Roman Catholic background. So it's and certainly the Santo Daime and UDV. So it's like when these cultures coming together can inform each other, and uh, we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should not be afraid of that. We should embrace it. We should embrace it because
Yeah,
they have.
yeah, yeah. I think that's beautifully put, Hunt. And that's honestly, it's part of the reason I'm here. It's part of the reason my soul has called me to this place is because that that intersection and that melting together and the possibility of having a Catholic indigenous shaman just it doesn't kind of exist in the field of possibility in England. So and that's kind of that's the intersection I'm walking, and I'm walking it with you guys
Oh yeah.
on my own side. And I think that's really astute point also about the Shipibo tradition and how they can kind of mutually inform. And I think there's more for us to discover actually. And I feel like these pieces are actually sort of, you know, the kind of religio. I can't remember the etymology of the term, but that sort of binding together, that bringing together of things is occurring through us. And for me, part of what I'm doing right now is reading Mircea Eliade's book on shamanism. He's one of the big scholars on it, and seeing all of these ways in which the process of the shamanic flight and this kind of spirit journey of the shaman, which was kind of the proto religion all over Europe and Mongolia and South America and so on, has a lot in common with the Christic. Like the shaman goes and dies for 3 days and then comes back, or the
Yes.
shaman has to
Yes.
go through a process of ritual dismemberment. And there's this kind of myth of the fall as well, this sense of like in a earlier time human beings had this fluid connection with the divine, and now it's fallen and only the shamans can go on that journey. And so this resonates a lot with Christianity, and it suggests there are some primordial truths flowing through them both. And I think I I had a weird incident just to close on this thread. Was invited on a boat trip with a Christian group in Europe in September 2023, and I was like months away from going on a big ayahuasca healing journey, and none of these guys had any contact with psychedelics, but we were able to find a common grammar and language, and they really were like, you're going into dangerous waters, take Christ with you, take Jesus with you. And at the time, I was like, yeah, you guys don't really understand this. And I have a lot of, my first trip was in 2016 also, so I've been
Okay.
journeying since then. And I did end up taking Christ with me into the ayahuasca ceremony, and I have found that my relationship to Christianity can bring a kind of like a masculine structure to the journey into the powerful feminine chaos of the plant medicine journey. And I think that's really just so valuable because you can go to such deep psychic waters and dark places and complete dissolution and collective darkness in these plant medicine spaces. And the role of Christ for me is to be like the one who's kind of able to be there with you and that you can kind of invoke in all of those places, because in some sense the Christ is the one who's already been there and sort of anchored God consciousness into the bottom of the pit. So if you go to the
Yeah.
bottom of the pit, you know, you can find him there.
Yeah.
That to me is the good news. And that's what I wanted to ask you, is like, you know, what is the good news? What is the gospel to you? Because there's so often we just hear, you know, the kind of rote Jesus Christ is
My Lord and
my
Savior.
savior,
Yeah,
and
right.
yeah.
Oh gosh. What I want to say one more thing about the what we were just talking about, because I think this
Sure.
idea that Jesus was I really I've thought this for a while, but I really more and more feel this way, that Jesus was an indigenous shaman in the
Wow.
and I think the story to look to that too is his baptism, and how immediately after that he goes into the wilderness for 40 days, which is to say an extended time, and comes to face to face with his own shadow. I mean, his own ego and his own desire for power and his own desire to be for accolades, and that those that time in the desert cracked him open to this deeper, bigger reality. And then he comes back and his ministry begins, you know, around 30 or whatever. But so I think that story, and in fact, Rupert Sheldrake, we had him on about 9 months ago for one of our talks at Ligare. And he wondered aloud if in the baptism of Jesus, if John the Baptist did not occasion a near-death experience for Jesus, that it would not it
Mhm.
would not have been the typical Anglican baptism where we sprinkle a little water. And if John the Baptist, as wild and crazy as he was, didn't hold Jesus underwater just enough time to bring about a mystical experience, that he rises up out of that, hears the Father say, "You are my beloved, with whom I am well pleased," and then off he goes. And that just feels like you said, a shamanic initiation. And that, you know, we don't never know really, but that feels resonant with me, uh, kind of from where I am now. And I've had some of those experiences where I feel like I'm going to die, and then out of that comes a whole new awakening. So, yeah. So that, just to kind of close that out, the good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ is, uh, about 2 weeks ago, I was meditating, and uh, I thought, what I need is a spiritual master, and I don't have to look far at all, because I think, among other things, Jesus is a spiritual master, and I think that's so much of he speaks in riddles and koans
Mhm.
and parables, and uh, so I think that's just a very almost an you don't have to be a Christian to see Jesus as a spiritual master, but it struck me as a new profound truth for me where I am right now in my life, is I need to dig back into the teachings of Jesus in a way. I've kind of been, after I've not been in parish work, I'm not as engaged with scriptures as I used to be, because I'm not preaching all the time and teaching. So that was more of a call to me to return to the stories, to return to the master and the teachings of the master. But so there's that. And then I think the good news of Jesus Christ is that healing and transformation and the love of God is available to all of us. We don't have, there's nothing to earn, there's nothing to do. It is there for the taking. And once we take it, then we're called to a different life. But there's nothing, that's the incarnation of Jesus brings that to the human experience. And that was a new idea. And we really still don't, 2,000 years later, don't really, haven't really grokked it, haven't really taken it in. And I think for me, that the healing, transformative power of the gospel is available to everyone by just being open to it. That's the good news to me. and it's alive and present in this very moment. And it's not about doctrine. It's not about doctrine. It's about experience.
Yeah, it
And
must be. It
it
must
must
be
be.
about
It
experience,
must be. Well, the scripture,
What
that's what the scriptures are. It's experiences of God. And so somehow we thought, well, that just stopped 2,000 years ago. We can't do that again. And yet psychedelics are, and Pentecostalism, and it's not like the church is dead to it, but we don't value or talk enough about experiences of God. People in recovery talk about it, but most of us don't. It's too weird to talk about, so we don't.
mm,
So figuring out a way to have that. Again, it's not about psychedelics; it's about the experience of God. And if psychedelics is a reliable and safe way for most people to do that, then why would we be afraid of it? We'd be careful about it, but why would we be afraid? I don't know. Because we
yeah,
really don't want to change.
do not be afraid.
We don't really want to change. Most of us don't, and we're often, in some ways, we're forced to. Or we don't unless we're forced to because of some tragedy or addiction or death or divorce or some major life change. That's like, oh, this is no longer working for me. This life that
Yeah,
I've thought I've created is not working for me anymore. That happens a lot of times in midlife. Happens in your late 20s. Happens again in your late 50s. For most people, a lot of people, and that's been my experience. So, but being shut off to the experiences where most Christians are, sadly. So, and this, I hope this is one of the. If we just wake people up to that would be, that'd be our work would be finished, psychedelics or not. Awaken to the power of the living God.
yeah, that'll do it. That'll definitely do it. I mean,
It'll
that's
definitely.
if you want
Yeah.
something that changes everything, you
Mm-hmm.
got it right there.
Right.
That's the ultimate confoundment. And, changes. I think of King Theoden in Lord of the Rings. I will not risk all out war. And he's like, all out war is upon you. And that's kind
Right.
of where we are with the meta crisis and with
Oh my
the
God. Yes.
collective shift that's happening. Like it's either happening to us or it's happening through us is kind of where it's at. And so some of us have kind of been pushed to make the leap or make
Yeah.
a succession of leaps a little sooner than others, but then those people need to kind of figure out how to hold the space for more people to move into that kind of journey that
Yeah.
we're on.
I mean, thinking about I mean, that it must have felt the whatever the things we're feeling now must have been what people in the first century were feeling. I think the people that Jesus was hanging out with, his friends and family, and people at the boot underneath the boot of the empire. It was well. That's all the talk about. That's all the apocalyptic talk is, which is
Yes.
kind of returning now. I mean, I think that it's okay. It's right on schedule, but that must have been what they felt too. That everything that they knew and trusted over a few generations, and those are the end of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, all these things would cause pre-modern and first century people to think the end was here, and it might be now. We might very well be standing at one of those moments, and it's going to take different things to wake people up to it. And people are starting to wake up. It doesn't take everybody to wake up, but it takes enough people. I think the fear in the culture is a result of that. The domination, the demonization, the control, the reckless. I mean, happening in this country, in the U.S. right now, the reckless destruction of institutions, mistrust of institutions. It's a sign of the apocalyptic times. That something new is being revealed, and if we
Mm,
don't get afraid, if we can manage our fear and not kill each other,
yeah.
the spirit might bring forth something new if we can just be awake to it and present to it, not afraid. It's hard. I mean, I'm it's not like I'm whistling my way through the current moment either. So,
Mm.
but I
But
keep
these
returning.
plant,
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
keep returning
these,
to the plants help, and just remembering that these eruptions have happened before, lots of
yeah.
times, lots of times.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a fractal kind of truth to to Christ, and there's a fractal truth to the circumstance of feeling like the world is going to end.
Mm-hmm.
Because in some sense, it's ending for people every day,
It is.
and it's beginning for people every day too.
Mm-hmm.
But
Exactly.
it's, yeah, I guess the piece I wanted to add in here is like, for me, it's been such a journey and such a sense of like coming gradually and more and more and more and more. Now getting to a place where relationship with God is the most important relationship out of all of them, and it's something I'm trying to like land more and more, and that creating sacred space and creating space of resonance is so central to how I feel I'm called to sort of serve in this life. But it seems like part of my job, and I'm also in the not knowing of this, is like I'm not feeling like I'm a Christian. And I feel like somebody needs to kind of stand in that spot of like, you can go to Holy Communion, you can go to Catholic Communion, you can pray all the time, you can have a deep connection with God, and also be journeying in these other domains. And I'm just trying to hold that sort of liminal intersectional space. And for me right now, not kind of almost, I feel like it's almost a temptation for me to kind of concretize into that title. I know for other people it becomes like a deep landing and an empowerment as well. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now, and that's also part of, Christianity beyond itself for me, is that I can hold this space and be deeply in it without being, defined as of
Right.
yet.
Right. Right. And I love the idea what you mentioned that you can, they're not two different worlds, but somebody that goes to, doesn't have to be somebody that goes to mass every Sunday, and then somebody that's working with psychedelics. Clearly those can coexist. But several of my colleagues in the study that were all religious professionals, mostly Christian clergy, several who I wasn't nervous or afraid. I was just up for the adventure. Honestly, I wasn't worried about it. And I thought with Johns Hopkins, why would I be worried? But several of my colleagues were, and several of them said what got them over the hump was their spiritual director or a friend said, "There's no place that God is not, and go and take God with you. That's all. That's all you have. There's
Mm.
nothing to be afraid of." And you said that earlier, and I think that's again to remind Christians that if we've got the armor of Christ, we don't need to be afraid, and we can go into strange and new lands if we feel called to it. If we feel called to it
Yeah.
by putting on the armor of Christ and trusting that God is everywhere and Jesus is the Christ energy is with us and the Spirit's with us and we're not alone. Whatever it is, whatever, even moving into this, finding ourselves in the midst of the meta crisis, God is still present. God is still acting. God is still calling us.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
I watched the Bonhoeffer movie last night. I hadn't seen it before, and uh, just thinking the darkness of the Holocaust and the Second World War, and certainly the church failed over and over again, and yet there was a remnant of people that didn't, and eventually the German church atoned for what it had done. I mean, it's okay. I mean, it's not okay that 6 million Jews died and that a million other people died, but we're evolving, and in some ways we got to cut ourselves, be compassionate with ourselves. And once you know, you've got to be different. Once you know, once you've experienced Christ, once you've let Christ into your life or acknowledge Christ is in your life, then you've really got to work on being a new creation. That's what baptism's about. It's a lifelong project, but and I'll say the same about a psychedelic initiation. Once that happens, then you've gotten another chance, and you're something a little bit different, and you see the world a little bit differently. Now what? Now what? Otherwise, you just had a little fun adventure, so,
Yeah.
or a scary adventure, whatever. But if what are the fruits of that? That would be the Christian question about psychedelics. What are the fruits of your experience? What changed? How are you different? How do you see the world differently? It's an
And
important
how can
question to
that
ask.
then like reinvigorate if you have Christians who are part of institutional communities and structures to reinvigorate them with the living
Yes.
energy of that? And I think maybe a key hurdle, and it's probably beyond the scope of today's conversation because we'll wrap up in a minute, but just a sense of like there is healing available through these medicines, through the experiences you have with these medicines, that as much as I'd like to have the humility to not say this, I don't feel like the same healing is available in participating in the mass, in participating in prayer circle, in having a relationship with the Bible. I think it's a different kind of healing, and it's one that the body of Christ is in need of. And, you know, if we do not have fear, and none of this is random, and God has created this whole situation in some sense, why else would there be these profound portals to divinity growing out of the ground that we've kind of been guided in ancestral times to understand how to use and connect with the divine?
Right.
Um, you know,
I do think it's in. I do think that transformation is there. I think the mystics. I mean, I think maybe some of the mystics had psychedelic experiences, but I think for the most part, it was their deep. Well, most of them were in monasteries and convents and had a very cloistered life and had all day to do this work, all year, all their lives to do this work, and it takes that level of engagement. Check it, punching the ticket once a Sunday, once a week is not really enough. I think there is real power in these rituals and liturgies, but I think for most of us, we're we're living in the world, and I think so. When people bring up the shortcut, was a shortcut? I'm like, well, maybe, but as a friend of mine says, isn't life hard enough? Like, isn't like,
yeah.
and are we going to talk?
Okay.
Are we talking about works righteousness, where if only if you work your butt off for something, is that only valuable? Is that the only time something is meaningful? Is if you've worked yourself to death to do it? That's not the gospel. I mean, that's antithetical to the gospel, although Christians feel that way. But it's a free gift, and I could say that about psychedelics. I mean, yeah, be careful. Know what you're getting into. Don't be careless. But
Yeah.
it can open up, and I feel like most of us are in a place where we need a really hard reboot, and in our spiritual, in our mental health, in our spiritual lives. And I think that certainly did it for me. It was a reboot. It was a big reboot. Those two experiences, those first two experiences with psilocybin, and uh, and I'm still a Christian, and I'm still a priest in the Episcopal Church, and all that. But I don't see it. I don't see it the same way. I see it much bigger, and I see the power that I didn't see before. I was kind of perfunctory doing my job. Now I see, oh, there's the spirit is here always. And what if we actually saw it, trusted it, felt it? So yeah.
Amen.
I just went on a little fantasy tour thing.
No, that was great. That
Yeah,
was a
yeah.
beautiful way to maybe close us out here. So yeah, on that note, just thanking you so much for joining me for this dialogue. I think it's obviously, as is made clear by this dialogue, profoundly important. I would say potentially civilization saving level importance. This intersection is really the key to civilizational regeneration and turning a terminal trajectory into into a resurrection and an evolution. So
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. I just wanted to comment just quickly about name. My last name is Priest, which is weird, and that's my job and all that. But I'm intrigued by your name too, Jacob, and what that means, wrestling with God, and what that's what you're doing. I assume you've done that on and off your whole life. All of us do,
yeah.
but I think maybe you got a little stronger mission on that. That's good. That's good.
Yeah, there was something guiding that name choice. So yeah, wrestling with God. And then I met a really nice Christian guy in an airport in Lynchburg, Virginia, and he said it meant friend of God. So
Oh, yeah,
now I'm
yeah,
kind of holding, yeah, both together.
yeah. That's good. That's
Yeah.
good. You should. Yeah. Thank
All
you. It's
right.
been a
Thank you,
real
hon.
wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Likewise.